I'm Jake Moran with TIG Realty. This video is going to be for those of you who have never done a contract or have been through the closing process, or maybe it's been a while in the state of Georgia, so that you understand some of the major mile markers that occur during a real estate transaction. We know that when you're in the process of buying or selling a house and moving and working and all of life, there's a lot of things that kind of come and go in the process, and this video is your reference point so that you know before it comes, and then when you're in the midst of it, what's going on or what's coming up next. So this process all starts when you have a binding contract. The contract goes binding once the seller has signed a signed offer presented from the buyer. The agents involved, the buyer's agent or the listing agent, are not the ones that qualify a binding contract. It's the buyer and the seller. Those are the parties involved in the transaction. The brokers are the ones managing that transaction from start to finish to make sure everybody does what they're supposed to do and everything is handled the way it should be in the state of Georgia. Now, a couple of the first things in the process of the contract is you have earnest money and you have due diligence. Your due diligence period is your buyer's inspection period, in which case they can do an inspection, which we encourage all of our buyers to do, whether it's a new construction or it's a really old home, doesn't matter. Always good to get a third party in there to go all the places on the roof, in the attics, crawl spaces, all the things, check the electrical, make sure everything is the way it should be, and present you with a report so that you know someone else that knows what they're doing has been through the home to check it out. Beyond that, your due diligence period is a time for the buyer to effectively walk away for any reason whatsoever. It is the buyer's due diligence, and sometimes it's the buyer's preference. This just isn't the right house for him. So it could be nothing wrong with the home. It could be nothing wrong with the inspection. It could just be the buyer found a different home. It could be, we've had this happen before sometimes, that a family member involved in the transaction doesn't like the home or doesn't like the neighborhood. That period of time, your due diligence period, is that safe zone for a buyer to secure a contract and decide whether or not they're going to move forward. In that due diligence period, the buyer is also putting up earnest money, which goes into an escrow account that is typically handled by the closing attorney in the contract or one of the brokers. That money, the reason it's called earnest money, is the buyer's putting up that money as an earnest intent to move forward in the contract. Now, if the buyer decides they want to terminate the contract at the end of due diligence or anytime before that, that earnest money comes back to the buyer. There's no claim that the seller has on it, and the buyer moves on to find another home, and the seller relists the property to find another buyer. During your due diligence period as the buyer, you look over the inspection with your agent, and you decide these are some things that are concerning or repairs that we want to have the seller initiate, handle, pay for, whatever, as part of the transaction. Now, sometimes those things can be done in the way of concessions, whether it's closing costs or some other thing. Sometimes it's contractors that are being paid at the closing table from the closing attorney out of the seller's proceeds. Sometimes it's a timing thing. Sometimes it's a logistics thing. Sometimes it's just a cash thing. So all of those things get managed during the due diligence period. And in that, the buyer's agent working with the buyer present to the listing agent or the seller what is called an ATAC, which is Amendment to Address Concerns. Basically, that's just a fancy way of saying this is the repair list we'd like you, the seller, to handle as part of the transaction for us to move forward in the contract. It is very important that that is managed and handled and signed by buyer and seller during the due diligence period, because if you go outside of your due diligence period and the seller has not signed it but the buyer has presented it, the buyer has nothing from the seller in terms of an agreement to do any of those repairs. Very important that those things are handled in a manageable time period during the due diligence period. After your due diligence period, everybody agrees what the repairs are, everybody agrees what the concessions are in the contract. There's a couple more milestones, and typically they're things that don't require a whole lot of attention from the buyer or the seller, but they're very important in the transaction. Those are things like the appraisal. This was one of the major changes that happened after the recession in the early 2000s, was the lender for the property, or if the buyer is paying cash, they have the right to do an inspection. That would be in the contract. They're going to initiate a third-party appraisal. The appraiser has no contact at all with the lender. They're doing it as an independent third-party evaluation of the price, and they submit that report back into effectively a portal that the lender has access to get that appraisal. If the appraisal comes in above the contract price, congratulations, you've got some built-in equity in the contract as the buyer. The seller doesn't get to adjust the price based on that third-party opinion. It's just a confirmation that we're at least good on our contract price to move forward from the lender's perspective. If the appraisal comes in below the sale price, the contract price, for instance, if it's a $500,000 contract and the appraisal comes in at $475,000, we have a $25,000 gap that has to be accounted for some way because the lender in that scenario is only loaning $475,000 towards the purchase of that house. Three things can happen. The buyer can come up with another $25,000, which most buyers don't have, but some do, and some really want the house. They know it's a bad appraisal or they don't care. The buyer can always come up to the contract price. The seller can always come down to the appraisal price. Maybe the seller knows they listed high and they just decided they wanted to keep that and hope they got a good appraisal. So the seller can come down to that $475,000, or the parties can meet somewhere in the middle. And that's effectively a concession on both. Anything above the $475,000, the buyer's coming out of pocket for, and the seller's not going to get that additional $25,000, but maybe they'll get $10,000. So those three things can happen as a result of the appraisal. If the parties cannot agree on how to manage that within the appraisal contingency in the financing exhibit, the buyer can terminate the contract because they're not able to agree on how to manage that $25,000 gap. That has to be done during the appraisal contingency, which is in the contract. It can't be 3 days before closing if that is beyond that period of time. Outside of due diligence, that's one of your provisions as the buyer to get your earnest money back at no fault of your own. The other is if there's some reason that the underwriters will not finalize the loan, that is not your fault as the buyer. Sometimes that can be an oversight in the initial underwriting. Sometimes it can be somebody missed something in a file. It can't be because you went out and bought a new vehicle the day before closing. Those kind of things are unfortunately 100% the buyer's fault, and you will probably forfeit the contract and your earnest money, which means no home and no earnest money coming back to you at the termination of that contract. Very important to know that. Don't go furniture shopping. Don't go open lines of credit. Don't go buy new things. Always, if you're the buyer, talk to your lender, talk to your agent before you do anything in terms of changing your normal financial patterns in a real estate transaction. Some of the other things that are happening is the closing attorney is doing their title work. They're making sure the deed is as it should be. There's no clouds on the title. Those things are important. In the state of Georgia, you have the option, if you're a cash buyer, to have title insurance or not. If you are getting a loan, you do not have that option because the bank is effectively buying the house with their cash on your behalf, which is why they're the first lien holder position in the mortgage. Title insurance is one of those things. I have a love-hate relationship because for the most part, like most insurance, you just feel like you're throwing money out the window. But when you need it, like most insurance, it's a lifesaver to have. So I encourage everybody to get a title insurance policy because you never know the what ifs down the road, and you never know who did what title searches on down the history of that property, and it's better to be safe than sorry. Once you get your repairs amendment, your ATAX signed, all the way up to closing, that is the time period where there's probably going to be some work being done, some repairs being done. If any of those things were part of the contract during that due diligence ATAX signing period. So if you're the seller and you know you have some repairs that need to be made and you're having trouble getting contractors to show up or people to do the work that's supposed to be done, make sure you reach out to your agent and possibly the closing attorney to get some help before you're really thin on time and don't have any good options. So within the last week of closing, this is the time period where all of us that have been in the real estate business, been through a lot of transactions, it's usually a very nerve-wracking time for us, even though it should be okay and everything, all the hard work should be done. And the reason is because the file is going through the final underwriting. Underwriters are kind of like the IRS. They hold the purse strings. They can require anything they want. They can ask for the seemingly most outlandish things that don't connect any of the dots in the transaction, and you have no vote. I have no vote. Your agent has no vote. Those things are required for the underwriters to release the funds for the loan to be purchasing the house. It's important for you to know if you're the buyer, if you're the seller, make sure you're keeping an eye on your phone, on your emails, on your text messages, because those things are usually very thin on time in terms of your final days to closing, and they are required to be responded to. One of the other things that is occurring during the last week of closing is 3 days prior prior to the closing, the lender has to present the closing disclosure to the buyer and have those signed off. Now, different lenders have different requirements, but those have to be signed. Some lenders require you to print it out, physically sign it with a pen and scan it back to them. Some of them, it's a digital signature, but that is a federal requirement that you have to sign as the buyer. You have to sign those things saying you understand what your mortgage payment is, you understand all the disclosures, you understand all of the financing and all the things that are going on in the number side of the equation for buying that house. You have to sign that within 3 days prior to closing, or your closing will get delayed. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about that. Closing attorneys do not have an option. Lenders do not have an option. Make certain if you're coming up on your last week of closing that someone is reaching out to the lender to ask them about the closing disclosures. Most lenders are very on top of things. Sometimes they get busy and they lose track of contract dates, and that's a very important boo-boo when it comes to you being able to move and buy your house and close on time. Also, typically around the same time, we're going to get what we call a clear to close. Those are the three most beautiful words in real estate. Clear to close means the final underwriting is done. Everybody that needs to look at the buyer's file, at the title, all the things, all that's been done. And then it's a matter of showing up to closing date. Whether you're a cash buyer or you're financing, you need to wire your money, I say safely, within about 6 to 8 hours before closing. You can do it a couple hours before closing, but most of our transactions, if we have a transaction that's closing on a Friday, we advise our clients to wire the money on Thursday, so that makes sure there's no delay in the Fed sweeping the wires over, so the closing attorney has the funds in their account for the closing on Friday morning, whether your closing's at 9 a.m. or 4 p.m. in the afternoon. The money's there waiting on you to show up. It's very important to have a valid form of identification, whether it's your driver's license or passport, something along those lines, because the closing attorney will require that for signing the closing documents. That's just their way of confirming the person and persons involved in the transaction are the ones, in fact, coming in to sign for those. And my last little tip for people, because so many things are involved when you're moving, you've got pets involved, you got jobs that you still got to get to, you got all your stuff in boxes, you can't find your forks. All those things are going on. One is utilities. Make sure if you're the buyer, you're getting the utility providers from the seller. Some of those you will have options for, some of those you won't. Make sure you get those things done and you get those accounts transferred as quick after closing or the day of closing as possible, so you don't have any service interruptions. Likewise, if you're the seller, make sure that you give the buyer at least a day. I typically tell people give them a day to get their utilities turned over, and then make sure your account's cut off so that if it slips off the buyer's radar, you don't end up showing up with a utility bill that you don't really have a whole lot of recourse other than just begging the buyer to pay because you forgot to turn it off and they forgot to turn it on. The last thing is getting your keys changed. It's very important because as the buyer, you have no idea who has keys or access to that home, and the seller may not either. If you're a new construction or the house is 50 years old, you have no idea who has what keys or who had what keys when. It's a good idea if you're the buyer to make an appointment with a locksmith to show up the day of closing once you've closed. You can't do it before closing, but once you've closed, so that you get all new keys, all new locks on your brand new house. It's just a good practice when you're buying a new home, and it's often overlooked because there's so many other things going on in the transaction. So like I said when we started, this is not an exhaustive list of all of the things and the ifs and thens that can happen during a real estate transaction, but these are some of the common things that you will typically see involved in almost every real estate transaction. And if you've not done this isn't your normal day-to-day, or it's been a long time, it's good to have something like this that you can go back to and reference, because there are a lot of things going on in life in general when it comes to a real estate transaction, and these things are very important to safeguard your money, your home, and your best interest, whether you're the buyer or the seller. If this is helpful, if you have questions, if you don't know where to start, or you're ready to move forward today, our information is coming up at the end. Feel free to contact us, follow us on any of our social media accounts, and if there's anything we can ever do to help you out, we'd love to.